This is Shawn Bland at the Art Center of Wilmington Island. Today I wanted to show you how to use some different kind of tools to paint this acrylic oyster painting. We're going to use a sponge, and we're going to use a palette knife, and we're going to use a flat brush. So to get started, I want us to do the background first with just a white wash basically, so that we can fill in all the canvas space. And then we'll go back and add texture with the knife and the shadow up underneath the oyster. But your picture is actually drawn with a paint marker. So as you begin to do the wash on the painting, you'll find out that you'll cover up some of the intensity of the line, but you're not going to lose the line with just the wash that we're putting on your canvas. So literally, if you'll just pick up enough of the paint on the brush that, and it's the sponge brush, remember, but just pick it up so that you can literally just push across the canvas and cover up all the white canvas. These canvases that you get have been gessoed one time, but this really helps to build a body of paint that really helps the paint accept the next layer that you have with a knife so much easier. This is an underpainting, and so we just want you to take time to go through and paint the whole picture. The lines that you have will show through as you cover them with white. White is very opaque, but if you will just put enough of the paint so that when you go through and push the brush back and forth, that you can still see your lines, or you could just reinvent them as we start painting and adding the color. But right now I'm just using the brush to go back and forth to spread the white paint out. Remember, I did put water on it so it would slide pretty good. It can be a pretty good coverage as far as just the opaqueness goes. But remember, our goal is just to do an underpainting, so when we get ready to do the texture with the palette knife, that we'll have enough paint up underneath it that if we have some fun spaces that we have with building the texture, that we don't have to worry about if we miss some of the canvas or not. So it's an easy way to build the texture. And so now I'm going to pick up the palette knife, and I'll show you why this is important. Once you go through, and I know it's hard to see white on white, so in just a second I'm going to go ahead and build the gray for you so that you can see it. But you're going to get the idea that because you're applying paint with a knife, as you pick it up and scoop it on, you're going to be able to make those textures stay raised up against that background space. And it's really very interesting to do that. And I'm going to show you first how to do it with the gray down at the bottom. But first I do want to do the shading in with the brush first, just like I did the shading in, the coverage in with the background. I'm going to do the same thing with the brush at the bottom with a gray. So now I'm just going to add black to the palette, and I'll go in and put just a little bit on the tip of my brush and add it right to the white on my palette, and now you can see I have a gray. And so the gray that I'm going to use, I'm just going up right up underneath the shell to show that the light's coming in and that you're able to see this shadow on this bottom right hand side. So I'm just going up a little bit with the gray, maybe a little bit more than halfway over here on this side. And I'm just putting a little bit of black and white, mixing it on the brush, going up underneath. I'm really using the edge of my brush to make a line. The line doesn't have to be straight. It can be really almost zigzaggedy, because that's the shape that we're getting, that the oyster shell actually has. And because all this is white and it's wet still, I'm just using the darker color right up against the shell. And then I'm coming out and I'm just blending the color together just a little bit so that the white is getting lighter and lighter as it moves out away from the shell. So you can see it's darker up underneath, and it has just a little bit of a gray value to it because I added the black. With the black and white, I'm able to put this shadow on the background space. So now the oyster is anchored down to that space, and now we're ready to add a little bit of the fun texture with our palette knife that we'll be using throughout the painting. I don't want the shadow to just be the black and white, a gray color. I want it to have a purpley kind of gray mixed into that so that it'll tie together with the colors that we're going to put inside. So I'm going to do a smidgen of the dark blue or the ultramarine blue, and I'm going to add red to it. It's just a cadmium red. And then when I mix those two colors together, of course, I get a purple. And with the black, I'm going to add a smidgen of purple. And then I'm going to be able to use that purplish color that's a little bit on the gray side. I'm going to add that right into this area. Now I'm going to use it the same tone that I have the gray that's already on there. So once you see the mixture that I'm making with this, you'll see how fun it is and how beautiful it looks just to use a little bit of a purpley gray color right in, very close and almost overlapping the grayish black color that I have in there. It just makes the color really fun and interesting to look at. And then I'm going to play it on out by just mixing a little bit of the white right onto my palette knife with the bluish gray color, and I'm extending the texture out actually to the end of the canvas, coming on out this way. So my value changed from being a black and white color with a little on the dark side, and then adding a bluish kind of purpley gray to the paint, and now adding a little more of the white to it, so it gradually goes from the dark to the medium to the light. And we'll talk a little bit more about the palette knife as we begin to move around a little bit more, because actually what I want you to be able to do as you start painting this is to notice that when you pick up your paint with the palette knife, that you're actually using the palette knife in a tilt. You're actually just, it's almost like a 45-degree angle from the palette board that you actually have your paint on. So what you're doing is you're going through and you're just picking up, and if you're right-handed and holding your palette knife with your index finger on the top, you have a lot of control on it. So you're actually just picking up the paint and at a 45-degree angle, and you're loading it on your palette knife so that you can release it onto your canvas. So as you begin to think about what you're creating in your background, it's actually just a fun textured space for your oyster. We don't want to do a lot back there because then it would take away from all the color that we're going to put in the oyster. It's going to be very colorful. But with the white we can continue adding that all the way around the oyster, and it's not going to take away from it, but it certainly adds a lot of character and interest. So as I begin to pick up more paint now, I'm just going to go all the way around and then go back all the way to where I started from. And literally I'm just sweeping the palette knife across the canvas and laying on enough of the texture that you can see it, and that you can actually, when it dries, you can actually feel it, that it's raised and it's not a flat surface like you would get with a brush. So if you've never used a palette knife before, you don't have to use a ton of paint, but you can use as much of it as you like to make it look interesting and make it the design that you want it to have with the texture. So there are several ways that you can think about putting the texture on. You can think about it maybe going all the same direction. If you like it a little bit more unified and you're a little bit more nervous about playing with the paint, you can actually just put it on all the exact same direction where you're just sweeping it across. But if you've not experienced the palette knife project before, just first, just actually take a big gob of the paint and just push it into the canvas and lay it there. And then you can actually use the tool to move it and put it where you want it to go. And if you want to be a little bit more conservative in how much you use the paint, you can just keep it all going the same direction. And it is very easy and fun, and it's unified, and you don't have to worry too much about anything not working, because everything has the unity, all of the palette knife strokes being reproduced or, you know, repeated over and over and over again. So it's a very beautiful way to paint with everything going exactly the same direction, but it's certainly not necessary. If you want to explore it a little bit more, you could actually make long swoops and just play in it until you get something that you're happy with too. So next we'll begin the work inside the oyster, and to begin with, we do know now that we have all of this painted with a whitewash, so it's going to be pretty easy for us to go in and start laying our color. We are going to lay it in with a flat brush first, and then we'll play up with a palette knife with the texture, so it'll have the same process that we used in the background. So looking at your inspiration piece, you can see that there are a lot of colors. In your kit, you actually have a light blue and a dark blue. So we're going to actually start by using the blues first. And you can actually use them together and separately. And so we are going to do both. But if you'll pick up the dark blue first on your brush and go in, and you'll see that you've got a space that you're going to consider the lowest part of the shell, where it starts going in to the space in an oval-like manner. And that's the space that we're actually going to put in the dark first. And that'll show you the difference between the scooped out part of the shell that's in the middle and then the outer area where all the layers are made. So this is the soft inside, very slick part. So I picked up some of the dark blue first, and I just used my brush to push it in and almost make a line. It's an edge, but it doesn't have to be very specific, because so many colors are going to overlap it, but I do want you to know where the space is. And then I want you to pick up a little bit of the light blue and actually mix white in with it to make it a little bit lighter. Now this blue is different than the first one because it almost has a green look to it instead of a purple look like the first one that we used. The darker blue almost goes purple. And so that is, see how purple this looks in relationship to how much more of a green feel that we get with the cerulean. This is the lighter color blue, but it also has some of the white mixed in it. And I'm just really overlapping the strokes and pushing the colors together a little bit until I get the look that I want. And then I'm going to begin adding more colors. I'm actually going to use white to continue to lighten it up, and then I'm going to start adding in a color that we call yellow ochre. Yellow colors, the yellow ochre is a color that's actually yellow and brown mixed together. So I'm going to put a few strokes of that, and you can see the way that I'm putting the paint on the brush. I'm almost leaving it, I'm pushing it into the canvas and I'm leaving it. I'm not over blending it. I'm not working it over and over and over again. I want to actually see the brush strokes of color that I put on there. So once I have a little bit more of the yellow ochre, and you can see once I put it on there, it turns greenish because I have the blue on my brush, and that's fine. That's what we want to have happen to begin with. So I'm going to add more white to my brush, and I'm just going to literally lay in the color and leave it there. I'm not doing any blending at this point because I want all the colors to be very, very strong. Now I'm going to go in and I'm going to add a little bit of the red to the dark blue. And if I do that, remember we get the purple color that we use down here in our background space. So at first when I pick it up, I'm not going to have the white mixed into it. So you can see that it's darker and it's very purpley. So it is the same color that I had down in here. It's just a good bit darker. But that's actually the red and the dark blue that's in your kit that's mixed together. And it is an ultramarine blue. So you can see the depth that you can get by putting that darker color in. I'm also going to go ahead now and put the color around this edge a little bit to bring out the shape so that it even intensifies the scooping in of this area being on the outside and this area going on the inside. So I'm going to do that a little bit more around this right hand side, and then I'm going to come on and I'm going to come in and do it now on the left hand side where I have this. It's a dark kind of purpley blue color. So now I'm setting up almost a shape that looks like an oval. And then I'll be ready to add more colors into that space. I'm going to continue with that color just a minute so that I can set up this dark area that's right in the center. So I just picked up more blue and more red and put that together. So it's the dark blue and the red, and it has a little bit of these colors in it. I didn't wash my brush at all. I just left it so that the colors would mix a little bit, and that's always helpful when you're doing a painting like this when you have so many colors. You don't want to separate, you don't want to wash out your brush and change every time you pick up a color. You want to add the colors and let them make new colors. So now I am adding a little bit of the white to it so that I'm coming up with a little lighter blue, and you can see it's a gray blue because it has the yellow ochre mixed in with the brush, and you can see now once I start adding the white to it that it gets a little bit lighter in this top section. So now the color that I have here that had the yellow ochre in it, I'm going to pick back up a little bit of the yellow ochre and lay it down. So now I've made a weaving of these colors pretty much that come all the way through that area. So with that white added into this light color, I'm going to go ahead now and start shaping up the side, because that's a good grayish color that I can use along the edge. It has the blue, a little bit of red in it to make purple, and then now it has the white. And I even added some of the yellow ochre back in it, so now that the color changes once again, and you can see how different it goes and how it changes every time I add just a smidgen of color. And that's probably what's important about this. You don't need gobs of color for things to change. Just a smidgen of the color will really enhance the picture as you're working on it. So now I have a lot of the grays and blues coming in. They look purpley in some places because I've added a little bit more of the red. But I'm going to go ahead now and set up a few more areas in here on this side so that you can see the different layers of the shell. So literally in here I'm just going through with that color. It's purple, but it has some yellow kind of color in it, and of course yellow ochre has some brown in it. So it's a real neutral, fun, dark purpley kind of color that's going to work for this. So I'm just continually going up and making the edge of the shell. I started in on the left side. Now I've gone on the inside of the shell and made the line. And then I'll continue and go on the outside, but I'm going to change colors a little bit. I'm picking up the brown. The brown that you have in your kit is a burnt sienna, and you can see that once I pick up the brown and just lay it right in with the same brush without wiping off or washing off it at all, the burnt sienna changes, so it's not just a brown that comes right out of the tube, but it's a fun brown that works and looks great with the oyster because I didn't wash the brush and I let the colors mix together. So I'm just coming along all of that space. In your original drawing that you had, you could tell that you had almost a double line here. In some places it almost had like 3 lines or spaces where you could see that many different layers, you know, in the shell. So what I'm able to do with the brush now is just to go in and add the brown in and really fill up this space. So now that I have a ledge or an edge or layers that are built up, and you can see it because I have the blues and the grays, and then I added a little bit more of the yellow ochre, and then I started adding the burnt sienna in. So now I'm coming all the way around and having all those colors mixed in. So now I have the look, and really the depth now is coming to the shell itself. So as I begin to work, I'm going to add more burnt sienna. But you notice when you have your brush and you put those colors in together and you carry all of them at the same time, when you paint with them, then they all tend to show up at different times depending on how you're holding your brush or how you're using it. So each time I turn my brush, different colors show up, and that's certainly interesting in a picture like this. So as I come around, every once in a while, I'll just pick up a little bit more of a different color. Like now I picked up a little bit more of the blue, and then I'll pick up a little bit more of the gray color that we originally had coming in here. And it's the same color that's on my brush, but I just added some of the white to it, and you can see how it turns grayish. So now I've gone all the way around the shell, and I've set up the perimeter or the edge. But I didn't do anything in a specific line. I made sure that as I was painting, I just put the color on there and followed the basic shape. Now as I'm coming back through, since I have more of the white on there and it's gray, I'm literally just coming back right over where I painted the brown and adding a brush stroke of color, so it actually pulls the whole shell together. Now I still have some work that I need to do to make sure that you can see the edge. So at this point I'm going to go back into the greens. So what I want to do is actually take the light blue that I have and mix some yellow with it. Now I still haven't washed my brush. I still have all the browns and colors on it. But I'm picking up blue, and then I'm adding a little bit of yellow. So it starts to be a little bit more on the greener side than what we've used so far. We haven't put the bright yellow in. This is the cadmium yellow, and it does not have any of the brown in it like the yellow ochre does. So once I picked up that yellow and added it into the blue, I really have this bright bluish color that comes around, and I'm going to use that to actually tie the oyster together from the outside of the shell to the inside of the shell in this area. So I just overlap the line a little bit and let it tie those two spaces together. So I'm actually laying in yellow and green mixed together, and I just laid it in on the inside part of the line that you see right here on the left, and now I have a greenish color, but it does have some yellow in it. So this color that I have now, actually we're going to use in a few more places. So I'm going to take the green and use it to follow in on the inside a little bit towards the middle, so that I get a repetition of the color. And I'm using just a line that I have in drawn for you in the kit in the same space. So it's almost like you're doing a half moon shape and you're just laying down the color. Now I'm going to begin to add a little bit more white to the green. I'm going to lighten it up a little bit, Sometimes I might want to put a little bit more yellow if I want it to turn lighter, or if I wanted to have a yellowish green color. So that's what I did in this particular instance. I add a little bit of yellow to the green that I already made, and now I'm adding some white to it, and it's getting lighter as I go to the center area. We want this to be lighter in this round central area. So now I'm adding just a little more of white to the brush. You can see each time that I lay down the brush that all those colors that are mixed together come right out. The only way you can use your brush like that with so many different colors is if you don't use it by over blending. You can't take your brush and just go in here and just play like that, because if you do, it's going to turn brown and you're not going to be too happy with the way that looks. So make sure that you just go through and you just push the color in and lay it down. It's almost like you're just pushing it right into the canvas, but you don't move it around too much with the other colors that are already there, because you have enough on your brush. So now I'm going to take more of a gray color that I'm going to use towards this outside area, and add color to that before I pick up my knife. So I'm adding just more white to the yellow green color that I already have on my brush at first, and this is about the color that I get, and I like that. I'm going to begin to add a little bit more brown to it and some of the gold color so that it changes. So every time I go to my palette, I'm picking up a little bit of a different color so that it is really fun and interesting to look at. And the brown in with the green is actually going to turn it the gray color that we want this to have. And you can see how I'm just laying down the color, and I'm actually using every one of the marks that I have that I make with the brush so that it makes the layers of the oyster. So as I begin to just come all the way down and around, then that's what I'm creating. So you can see how many times I'm going back and forth over to my palette to pick up the color. So one time I may pick up a little more white, but one time I may pick up a little bit more of the light green that I mixed, or add a little bit of the brown to it as I just continually go around the shell. So I'm gonna just keep going around with that color. That way it's unified. It puts all of the color that I have on my brush sort of from one side of the shell to the other. So once again, you can just lay down the paint and leave it. Don't stay in any area a very long period of time, because if you do, you're going to get an over mixing that you're not going to be happy with. So now I've gone all the way around and have paint in most of the area. So the areas that I don't have, of course, I'll be adding it in a little bit more, but this time I'm going to do it with a little more white. So I'm picking up white again, and I'm coming back through and going around one more time, just laying in. It's about a 1-inch stroke that's creating the look that I want it to have. The oyster is made up of many layers, and to get them to look layered like that, that brush stroke is going to be very helpful to you, so that it looks like it's not flat. It looks like the area is turning and making a form that's actually round, which you certainly want it to do. So the first time when I went around, I added color on this outside part. So now I'm going to move in and add it to this inside part, because I did not work in there a while ago. So now I'm just adding a little bit more of the white that has all the greens and blues and grays in it. So now I've covered around the inside just a little bit. So then I'm gonna continue on. I've got one other space right over here that I need to fill in that I didn't get any space, and that's this second layer that's over here on your left-hand side. So now basically I have the shell colored with a grayish like green color that I feel is very natural and very appealing to look at. And then I'll begin to add new colors next so that it looks like a very colorful oyster shell. But before I do that, I am going to wash the brush so that we can start with the palette knife. So now that I have the brush washed out, I'm gonna go for playing with the palette knife a little bit more. If you don't feel like that you mastered it the first time, here's your chance. We're gonna try it again to see what you can do. I'll just review a little bit. I'm gonna actually take white right out of the cup so that you can see how I'm actually going in and just picking it up. And I have a glob of it on there. When we were playing in the background earlier, when we did that, you can see how we just laid it down and then flattened it out. Now we're gonna do a little bit of that, but not quite as much. We're gonna have a little bit more control of it when we go inside. But sometimes we're gonna add more color and sometimes we're just adding more texture. The look and feel of this is very greenish, grayish, and so we can make it pop with some new colors. We can also make sure that we add enough white to it that the oyster shell looks bright and shiny. So I'm going to begin doing that first because I want to make sure that this place is very shiny and that when we go through and we put that in to this space, that you can see how dramatic it is for the shell. You can make it as globby as you want to by just laying layers on, but it's certainly not necessary, and it's not gonna make your painting or break it depending on which way you go. It's just really what you like. But because we use so much in the background, I wanted to give you a chance to see what it would do when we laid it down into the shell. And this space is actually flat. It's got a little, of course, bow in it where it fans out and begins to curve. But if you wanted it to look really shiny, like it was a clean oyster, you could definitely put a lot of white in that space. Now, in other spaces, we're not going to carry as much. Like I said, you can play up here all you want to in it. Just avoid covering up all the color that you spent so much time putting in. But I do want to show you that if you get carried away with it, you can definitely go back in and just put a little bit of color right in with the palette knife so that you can tie the color in with the texture, because that is very important. I picked up a little bit of the brown, which is the burnt sienna. I added a little bit of the yellow ochre to it. So that color was basically already mixed on my palette. So I just went right back into that color. This was the brown, that's the burnt sienna. I had a little bit of the yellow ochre that I was using here, and so because that color is already mixed in, I just decided to carry it right back into the space where I used it while ago. And so if I do that, then I feel like that I mixed the palette knife colors instead of just laying on a completely new color, because you can have the brush strokes and the painting here. You don't have to use the palette knife to paint the whole oyster. You can just do some parts of it. And so I started off with the white. I made sure that it allowed the white to really, make the oyster look like it was glossy in here. And then everything else that we do is just fun and a way for us to explore the color. So now I'm going to add a little bit more of the cad yellow. That's not the golden yellow, but it's the bright yellow. We went from being sort of neutral-like in the very beginning, and now we're going to pop it with a little bit more color. Most of the time we'll add a little bit of white to it. So with what I already had going on with my palette, I took the cad yellow and added a little bit of white to it. So it's not like a fluorescent yellow, but it shows up nicely in that space. So basically I loaded it onto my palette knife and now I'm laying it down and almost making like a half moon shape or half a circle with the yellow. So it really emphasizes the area that we're gonna play up with color in the middle. We don't want to leave out any area that needs color. So I'm just gonna take the knife and come in here. And this time, I'm just gonna use basically the point of the knife. I picked up some of the same color that I used out here, but in the center, I'm just going in, I'm not making a whole blob of color like that. What I'm doing is just using the tip of the brush, I'm using a tip of the knife and just coming in and using the point of it. And so the point allows me to have control and to put the color just where I want it to go. So I started with the yellow here. Now I want it to turn a little orangish, and I want it to have some red in it. So now I'm going over to the palette and I am continuing to, I'm picking up a little bit more yellow. This time I'm gonna add the red to it. And now I have an orangey red. But on my palette, I didn't take off the other color that I had on there. So sort of underneath the orangey red color, I have a yellowish green color. And that way I don't create a color that looks foreign to the shell. It looks like it fits right in. And of course it looks very nice there. It's a little orangey, but it has a little of the brown and green in it, so it's not too much color for the oyster. So I like the way it fits there. So now I want to add more to it. And that's the thing, once you start painting, you just figure out what works in the space that you have. But in a video like this, you're actually watching to figure out how artists can use color and how it works in your particular image, in this case an oyster. So I added the red and the yellow, and then I came around and I'm just using, once again, the tip of the knife. I'm not using the whole blade, I'm just using pieces of it. Mainly on this point I'm using the actual point of the knife where I'm just picking up the color. And then sometimes I'm actually going to use the line of the knife, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But just put a little bit of yellow on the tip of your knife, and then to get control over how much you have or where you want it to go, you can literally just pick up a little bit of the yellow and mix the color that you actually want to have in your space. And then once you get it mixed, have enough on your palette knife that you can come in and then put it where you want it to go. So once I put this in, I can take, once again, the white. You can always use the white and that greenish color that we made that looks grayish that's on your palette. And if you've lost that color, all you need to do is put a smidgen of the blue and the gold in it, and then you'll automatically have this grayish color. So now I want to use a little bit of the gray that we originally mixed, and I want to come in and I want to begin pulling those colors. And at this point I'm just going to do really a little bit of scraping with the whole palette knife. So I'm literally just taking the palette knife. I had just a little bit of that on my flat space, and now literally once I lay it down on the oyster, you can see that I'm just scrubbing it right across, because I want the oyster shell really to look like it's a little bit old or weathered, or it has a lot of character. And so to do that, this technique is going to be just a little rub right across. It's like you're almost shining it, you know, you're rubbing it, and you just pull a little bit of that paint across it. Now if you feel like that you're losing lines and you're a little bit worried about it, just lighten up on the pressure and just don't go as long. Make short strokes. So let's see what that looks like. Literally, I'm just laying down the color where I want it to go. And this is the grayish green color that we had. I'm just laying that down, but instead of seesawing back and forth like this, which is a great technique and it is really fun to do and it works in a lot of places. But if you feel like you don't have as much control of it, then you can certainly just shorten the strokes and just lay the paint where you want it to go. But literally that's the fun about making a palette knife painting, is going in and experimenting with what you can do with the palette knife and seeing how much texture you can add and how it changes the look of the oyster. So now I had that grayish color on there that I used a little bit. Now I'm lightening up with white. So now I'm just carrying mostly white on the palette knife, but it does have a little bit of the grayish color that I previously used. So now I'm going to go through and I'm just going to set up a little bit more of a layering that the oyster needs before it's complete, so that you can see as many of the layers as you want to see. So literally I'm just going through and I'm using just the edge or the tip of the knife, and I'm literally just putting the paint on in small 1-inch sections so that you can see how you can literally see the paint standing up away from the canvas, and it looks heavy and it looks thick. And you can leave as much there as you want to. If you feel like that you get too much and you're unsure about if you should have that much, then all you have to do is take your knife and spread it out just ever so slightly towards the inside part of the oyster. And then the depth of it, the layering of the shell will be minimized. So you don't have to have it really deep and heavy with paint if that's not the style you like. But using the edge of the or the tip of the palette knife allows you to get a real fun edge and layer almost at the same time. So now we're going to tilt the brush, the palette knife just a little bit more, and as we go around to make this lighter layer that's laying around the darker colors that we put a while ago, I'm literally just using the side of the knife as I go in, and it's literally making the edge for me. Remember, we didn't make an edge earlier with the brush. We just laid the color in and sort of left it there because I said the edges weren't very important. And so now we're making some edges because we want our oyster to literally have the shape and the layering look. So each time you want a different layer, then you can certainly just take the knife and you're scooping up the paint, you're laying it down right across the edge where you want your layer to go. And remember, all of these techniques you can use at any time that you want to. So you can use the technique where you just zig and zag and play around. You can use the technique where you just push down the paint and swoop it across so that you're actually just laying down the color pretty flat but raised up a little bit. But then you can also use the knife where you're literally just going in and making it stay raised. You can put more like a glob on your brush, and then once you get to the canvas, you push it down, and then you just you push it down, and then you ease off the pressure. You push it down, you ease off the pressure, and it begins to disappear and get thinner and thinner as you move out to the edge. But you can actually have as much laying down in a spot as you want to. So as you pick up the white and use a little bit of the yellow ochre in with it, and maybe even a little bit of the brown, you can come back in and hit just the edges in places like this. And literally I'm just using the edge of the knife, and you can see that I can get a line, and that creates even another layer that is fun and interesting for your shell. So try different things as you go along. You don't have to stay exactly as I have made every line. You're welcome to try different things, and I encourage it. One of the other things I'll do now is use a little bit more of the color to finish up. So I'm going to get a little bit of the red, and I'm going to go in and put in a few more, just little smidgens of color throughout, so that you can see. Just went around in a couple of places and just barely touched it with the red, because it's wet, because you've got so many layers of color. If you just barely touch it in a few places, you can see it catches on, but it doesn't overpower any particular part of the shell, because it blends with the paint that's wet, that's already under it. Okay, now so we can use a yellow green to add emphasis to our picture by just picking up a little bit on the edge of the palette knife and laying it around, almost like an oval or circular shape, so that your eye can just follow through with the yellow green. And then we might pick up some of the turquoise green, and we can do the same kind of thing. We can accent almost exactly where the yellow green was put, and just branch out a little bit more from it, especially if you like that color. And this is the opportunity where you can really detail your picture and make it unique, in the sense that you can pick out if you want more yellow green or more of an aqua green, or if you want to go back and add a little bit more of the even the like the cerulean blue, where you have that kind of color. It's a little bit deeper. So as you begin to finalize your color selections, if you want a little tiny smidgen of red, that really plays up against the greens and looks good. If you want to go back into the yellow ochres, you can see just a little bit of that color goes a long way in adding interest, and it's a bright and colorful way to create something very interesting in your oyster shell. And you can even go to the purple side if you want to add some of that in. But either way, as you just keep playing with your oyster shell with your palette knife, I hope you enjoy the colors, and I hope you've enjoyed painting with us today. Thank you.